Okay, very good. Well, why don't we officially get started? So this is a regularly scheduled meeting of the Finance Committee, and it is Monday, September 11th. We will come back and talk about that in just a second. I just want to start by introducing the counselors who are here with me right now. We have Counselor Oliver from Ward 1, Counselor Norton from Ward 2, Counselor Gentile from Ward 4, Counselor Humphrey from Ward 5, Counselor Noel from Ward 6, myself from Ward 7, Counselor Kalis from Ward 8. I wanted to start the meeting with a moment of silence. I appreciate everybody being willing to start a little later this evening to allow time for folks to be able to attend memorial services with respect to the horrific attacks of September 11th. And I would just like to take a moment in memory of those who lost their lives on that horrible day, and a moment of thanks as well for all of our first responders and the many volunteers who not only some of whom of course gave their lives, and many of whom just worked tremendously to preserve as much life as they possibly could. So if we could just take a moment of silence, please. Okay, thank you very much. We've also been joined by Councillor Maliki from Ward 3. We are going to start our meeting with item 305-23, the acceptance of a donation from the Garden City Preservation Society. Let's see, we've been joined by Commissioner Banks, so if I could turn it over to you to introduce this item, please.
Hi, good evening. So the Garden City Preservation Society reached out to us because they're looking to dissolve their account. They're not going to be a formed group any longer. They thought that providing these funds that were left over in their account to the city would be an appropriate place for them to have the remainder of their funds expended in a way that was consistent with the purpose of their funds. They are looking to have us put this into a special account, and it would be used to be able to provide beautification in the Newton Center area. We don't have a specific project planned yet, but we have just hired our new Assistant Superintendent of Grounds Maintenance Beautification. And so Bob would certainly be involved with coming up with some ideas for the area. We have some nice plantings, some bench areas, and other spaces that could be appropriate for this funding source. So we're just asking to be able to accept the funds. I think it's 950 around there. I don't have the exact number in front of me, but
looks like $948.55 according to the mayor's letter.
Perfect.
Okay, let me turn it to the committee. Do we have any questions or comments for Commissioner Banks? Councillor Noel.
I'm happy to move it. I don't have any questions.
Okay, we have a motion to approve. Any further discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor, please say aye.
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 Any opposed? Any abstentions? That is, I believe we're 8-0. Is that right, Mr. Cudmore?
That is correct.
Okay, very good. So we're all set with that. Commissioner, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Great rest of your evening.
Good night. Thanks.
We're going to go on to 306-23. Her Honor, the Mayor requesting authorization to establish and appropriate funds to an Operations Booster Stabilization Fund. Ms. Lemieux, let me turn it to you. And I know you had asked to give a presentation. So if we could please allow Ms. Lemieux to share her screen, that would be great.
Thank you and good evening, everyone. Obviously, hopefully you all heard our presentation last week. And so what I wanted to do this evening, let's see, let me make sure I can make this work. Okay, can everyone see that? Yeah, okay. All right, so thank you. So what I wanted to do this evening is I put together a very short slideshow, really designed to get us to focus right to the heart of the matter that is before you. So you clearly heard all of the rest of the forecast last week. I wanted to dive just a little bit deeper into what the question really is that's before you. As you know, we talked about this last week, and in fact, even a few weeks ago when we announced this proposal that we had, overlay surplus has significant funds have been declared, as well as the comptroller's office has been working on free cash. It still has not been sent to DOR and certified yet, but Steve Curley is here, and you know, he certainly is getting closer and closer to having an understanding of what that number is going to be. And so just as a reminder to everyone, the Board of Assessors declared $20.5 million of overlay surplus in the middle of August. The driving force in that was the actual withdrawal of Eversource of 9 of their 11 cases. Not only were we able to have $20.5 million declared in overlay surplus, it also became clear that because they withdrew their appeals, we basically did not need the bulk of the funds that were in our appellate tax board interest fund. It used to be, when we set that fund up, it used to be that we needed to have a separate overlay fund for every single year. Back in the Municipal Modernization Act, which I think was 2016, that designation was actually changed, and now we can lump all of our overlay funds together in one account. And so as long as we stay conservative, as we have always been, if we thought that we needed any interest for some case that we would potentially lose, we would just make sure that we kept enough funds in the overlay fund so that we would not run into what we did a decade or so ago when we lost with Verizon. The combination of these two items is $26 million. And so our proposal to you is to establish an operations booster stabilization fund and to use that as we move forward. The other thing that we are in the process of doing is certifying free cash. The comptroller's office estimates that we will land anywhere between 21 and 23 million. I believe at the moment, he seems to be narrowing in on about 22.5 million, but we will certainly be in that range. As you know, last year we had the most free cash certified that I think the city ever has had, and that was because of Eversource. This year, the 21 million is really driven by two key things. And then you see all the other years, we bounce around between 10, 11, 12, 13. So these are two very, very unusual years for us. One of the reasons that we have so much free cash again being declared this year is because we held on to 5.4 million of our free cash from last year. We knew we still have potential legal settlements that we need money for, retroactive wages. And so these funds, it's more of a timing issue with these funds. We may end up using them this current year. We may end up needing them to roll over again into next year. We don't quite know what the timing will be, but we know that we certainly need to have these funds set aside. In addition to the money that we had roll over again and almost become recertified as free cash, we also, our interest income, as I think you all know, skyrocketed last year. So our actual to budget variance is $8.4 million. We took in just under 9.1 million last year in interest. When you look at this chart, this is 15 years. We had 1 year in the last 15 where we took in 3 million. We had 2 years where we hovered around 2 million. 1 year when we were at about 1.5 million. And all of the other 10 or 11 years, we earned less than $1 million in interest. So this is certainly, you know, a good news story for the city. There's always a bad news side because this means our borrowing costs go up also. But right now, I'm really focusing on how this large free cash number came to be. And these are really the two key items. This is almost $14 million. So we would only have had about $8 million in free cash if we hadn't carried some money forward and if we didn't have this huge interest variance. That's an important thing to look at, because as we keep trying to budget, you know, tighter and tighter each year, we generate less and less free cash. But at least for this year, we will be certifying a significant amount of money, a lot of it coming from free cash. The revenue and expense projection for next year, we didn't actually have a slide on this this year, so I wanted to make sure as the Finance Committee that you were aware that the plan that we have before you, the book that we passed out to all of you, actually has, as it typically does, a projected gap. I always try to forecast revenues very conservatively and expenditures at what we think 100% of our needs will be. This gap grows to about $19.9 million, excuse me, in fiscal 2031. So even with all the things that we've done, we're still projecting a gap that I believe is manageable. And as you know, every year we have to close this gap and submit a balanced budget to you. But I want to make sure that you all knew this number. So what is our recommended pathway forward? And it is the establishment of this Operations Booster Stabilization Fund. There are three things that we are looking to accomplish with this. One is to relieve pressure on city finances so that we can boost funding for the NPS operations while we are maintaining our current pension funding schedule. So in a nutshell, this is what I think everybody needs to know. This is why we have come forward looking to do this. Relieving pressure on the city finances. What will happen? Currently, so a year ago when we did our presentation, we were still forecasting 9.6% annual growth in the appropriation for pensions. We all know that changed. So the blue line is where we were a year ago with pension funding. The green line is our 6.6% increase. What our request is to set up this stabilization fund so that we will still in the budget have the 6.6% increase for pension funding. However, it's the revenue source that is going to fund our pensions. That extra 1.6% is what this booster fund is all about. By doing it this way, okay, if we take our 26 million, we set it aside, we earn interest on it over each of the next 8 years, we will have growing amounts of money because that 1.6% grows exponentially. So we'll start off next year that we have, it's actually, I think it's 659,000 that we would be using in 25 to close that 1.6% of the funding schedule. It grows all the way to 7.8 million by fiscal 32. By doing this, we relieve what we need to fund through the general fund. The general fund increases for pensions, and it allows us to take these funds and repurpose them. Now, there are two things that we're looking to do with these funds. One will be to boost NPS operations, and the other will, in a sense, either allow the funds to drop to closing the gap, or you can think of it two ways, or helping us to make sure that we are able to increase municipal expenses also. But the part that we're really trying to commit to and what the plan involves is taking 70% of these savings and applying it toward the NPS budget. So the pension funding, we were at a 9.6% growth by fiscal 30. A year ago, we would have been at 73.4 million in funding. If we're already down to the green line, but if you approve this by fiscal 30, it will be 55 million that we will need. So it's a huge difference in what we are able to do operationally throughout the city. Supporting NPS. I'm going to, somehow I have to fix my screen. Because I have all of our pictures where It's not going to help me. Does anyone know how do I, maybe this? Okay. All right. I think I'm okay. So what I wanted to do in fiscal 24, when the override failed, we really spent a tremendous amount of time trying to figure out how we could move forward and have creative initiatives and direct more money to NPS. First thing we did with your approval was we took 10 million of free cash, reduced what we would borrow for Lincoln Elliott. That has created a $600,000 permanent increase to the NPS budget. We did the $1.4 million bridge grant, again, with your approval, that was due to the huge increase for out-of-district placements. I don't know yet what the final results will be of that. We certainly are hoping that the state will be far more aggressive in reimbursing us for out-of-district placements. So we have called it a bridge grant for 1 year. We think it's one-time money, but we will clearly have to make sure that we understand what the future really is of all of that. We took $580,000 of NPS of free cash for legal settlements for NPS. We worked with the retirement board, extended our funding schedule by a year so that we could free up funding for the Horace Mann ad reno, which of course was part of the operating override. This money, this 1.3 million, doesn't technically go to the school budget, but it absolutely is for the schools. That's a permanent increase there. We reduced the Medicare Part B expenses for Newton Public Schools in 24 by $650,000, which is a permanent reduction of funds for the need for them. We transferred their OPEB money to the city side, which is going to save them probably at least 2% growth in that number for years to come. We took $410,000 from ARPA and put that toward their summer maintenance projects so that they would have more breathing room with their class sizes this year. So total for fiscal 24, between one-time and permanent money, almost 2.4 million in one-time funds, 2.6 million in permanent money, recognizing that 1.3 of that is in debt service and the other 1.3 is really in their budget. For next year, fiscal 25, the Medicare Part B reduction will result in another $325,000 worth of savings. That's going to be a permanent savings for them. And again, each year it will be about a $60,000 increase in savings for them with what we did with OPEB. So as we're moving into our fiscal 25 budget, since the failure of the override, we have redirected about $3 million to their actual operations and $2.4 million to one-time funds. In addition to that, what is our request? Our request is to set up this booster stabilization fund, which would enable us then to add further funding to their budget so that we would start by fiscal 25 of adding almost $500,000. And by fiscal 32, it would be almost 5.5 million. When we do that in fiscal 33, our intent would be to go back to a 3.5% annual increase in their allocation, but that 5.5 would get baked into their base. That's part of our plan to bake it into their base. In total, this ends up funneling an additional approximately $21.7 million to the Newton Public Schools over the next 8 years. Again, what do we want everyone to realize? What are we trying to accomplish? We are trying to relieve pressure on the city finances so that we can boost funding for NPS operations while we maintain current pension funding schedule. And so with that, Madam Chair, I am happy to stop sharing my screen. Perry also has the presentation up so that if anybody wants to go back to any of the specific slides, if you allow him to screen share as we have this conversation, he can go in and pull up any slide if anybody wants to go back and have questions about anything in particular. But beyond that, I didn't want to spend too much time. I wanted to be able to make sure that we really got to all of your questions. But again, I just thought it was important to kind of get us focused, like to funnel in on the information and what's really before you. So with that, Madam Chair, I'm more than happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Lemieux. And we've also been joined by Councillor Downs. Councillor Kalis, I see your hand up. Why don't you start us off?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and Ms. Lemieux, thank you so much. Perry, can you put that there's a slide that mentioned the ATB at the beginning? I guess my question on that is, did you say that that ATB, I forget if it was a fund or if it's interest, the interest released 5.5, does that mean that account is going to zero, or is it not needed anymore?
You are correct. It is not needed anymore. It will ultimately go to zero. Where I think the docket item itself asks for the balance is $5,513,000 and some change. What we're asking to do is take the $5,513,000 and transfer it to the booster fund. The change, the few hundred that's left in there, next year when we go through our close process and we carry forward any of those funds like that, we just won't carry it forward. And at that point, it will cease to exist. Okay. And the reason for that is 4.6 of that money was Eversource payment. And so we do not need to pay them the interest because they're dropping their cases.
Okay. And then my second question, I think, Perry, the second to last page. Actually, the third to last, this one right here. Yeah. So am I correct in that the 26 million booster fund, it's not throwing any cash off in 24 because all of the numbers here are interest, right?
They are not all interest. If we go to, Perry, can you go down probably slide, do you still have slide 21? Did you delete those yet? Yeah, if you go down.
Yeah. Yes, I did delete those. I can pull up. Oh,
okay. The Excel sheet that we sent to all of you shows, so in the first year or two, it's actually only interest that's needed to get to that difference of a 5% increase in the allocation versus a 6.6%. As we get rolling, we start to use principal also because that amount that's needed increases. And so the intent of this is for the stabilization fund, the booster fund, to be depleted at the end of this. It is not our intent to have a permanent stabilization fund. The intent is to use this money to soften that increase over the next 8 years so that we both give some funds, extra funding to the schools, and get our pensions funded on this schedule. So if we do better, then, so if you look at, I don't know, Perry, if your cursor can go down to the third section where it says less contribution, plus interest earned, that line. Yeah. We have been very conservative in projecting that. We went by what the feds are projecting, and I think it's by fiscal 27 or 28, I forget which year it is now. We actually are only forecasting 2.5% increase for this fund. 2.5% interest for the fund. If we make more money, which we will obviously be looking at every year, we might find ourselves, my hope is that we will do better than what this projection is, and that we would potentially find ourselves in a position where instead of still having to increase the appropriation for pensions by 5%, if we're doing better with interest, we might be able to increase it by 4.8 or 4.9. That will all be dependent on what happens with interest. So in year one, it's only interest that we would be taking. In year two, it's only interest. By the time we get to year three, is when we start to need some of the principal also to take some of the money.
Okay, but there is variability, and I think that's an important fact.
Yes.
Okay, there's variability either to the upside or the downside, or you're perfect. But that's good to know. And then the last thing is, are you also saying with that variability, you're going to stick to the 70-30 split in terms of spending?
Well, that's our intent. If you look at the bottom section is the split. So right now, our intent is to do 70% to the schools, let the other 30% drop to either, you can look at it two different ways. It's a matter of semantics, really. If we are saying, which is what we are saying in our forecast, that we are going to increase municipal expenditures by 3.45% each year, if that would cause a gap, this money kind of goes to helping to close the gap. Or you could look at it as saying, well, this money helps us to make that 3.45% increase. So we are not doing is adding this difference to city department budget. So whereas the schools, we are taking their appropriation and then adding, I don't think we have a slide that shows this, but in your forecast, where we show our projected expenditures, you can see what we've projected out for all the years is the school department budget increasing by 3.5% each year. We then add onto that this difference, this 70% of the savings onto the 3.5% increase. We do not do that for the municipal departments. We just have the municipal departments increasing at the 3.45, and we do not specifically have an increase for our municipal departments because of this.
Okay. I have one last question. I'm sorry, I'm holding people up. So there are some that might say, hey, take the 26 million and throw it all at the schools this year. That, the way that you presented it, that's impossible because we have an obligation for our pensions that we have to hit, and this is just helping us generate cash off of that obligation. Is that correct? I just want to make sure.
Yes. If we ever gave either a portion of the 26 million or the entire 26 million to the school department, it would be one-time funds that they would need to be very, very careful with how they used it. If they used it as part of the negotiation, and when they got to year 2 or 3 or 4, these funds would run out. And then what would they do? We would not have a safety net for them. Instead, this helps them to be able to increase by about 3.7% per year, figure out how they want to use the funds, and know that we would have this fund committing so that we only had to put a 5% increase toward the pensions.
Thank you.
And if I can just, the one last piece so that everybody gets it, the reason that we don't have a financial cliff, so we would have a financial cliff if we handed all of this money to the schools. There was no doubt about it. The reason that we don't with this plan is because in year 8, 2032, is when we will, by this plan, have our pensions fully funded. And so we no longer need that huge amount of money. We will put something less toward OPEB in 2033, less than what we were doing with pensions. And so where before we might have had a bigger windfall, if you will, for the city in fiscal 2033, what we're really doing is eating up that windfall along the way, if you will. So we don't have a big windfall in 2033, but we don't have as much of an increase in each of the next 8 years.
Okay, thank you both very much. Councillor Humphrey, you're next.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Actually, I wanted to go back to Councillor Kalis for a second because your last question before what we just heard did not sound like it got answered, because you were talking about the way you were describing the plan is not consistent with what's actually proposed. So I was wondering if you could rephrase the question and make sure that we're actually getting the answer to that question.
Is it the question of
because the plan is not, I mean, you used the phrase earlier about throwing off cash or something like that. Like, that's not what the plan is. So I think that Ms. Lemieux didn't hear the question correctly.
So the question was I think you answered it, but maybe you didn't, was the 26 million that's there is generating or throwing off, I think I used those terms, interest, and that is part of the funding source that we're getting over the next 8 years, correct?
So the 26 million would be earning its own interest. That's why
only a little bit, though.
Right. It's what I have on that line. So we would project this year it would earn at least $975,000. Next year, my projection is $1,060,000. What it will be is you'll see the interest earned each year is going to decline for two reasons. One, because we are forecasting interest rates going down to 2.5%. The other reason, because we are absolutely going to be taking some of this principal away every year, beginning in fiscal 26 or 27. Beginning in fiscal, actually, it doesn't even really start if I look at my numbers until fiscal 28. No, I'm sorry, 27. So the first 2 years, it's strictly interest that we would be taking from the fund. But by the third year, it's principal and interest that we would be taking. And then that principal decreases every year thereafter.
Okay. If you could put that chart back up on the screen, I just wanted to jump off of this and then ask a few more questions. So essentially, though, I just want to emphasize that this is the interest is largely offsetting the fact that this is divided up over time. The interest that we're getting is a relatively small amount by the numbers you've just given us and what you've said. In fact, it sounded like the interest was probably projected to be less than the rate of inflation. I mean, we don't know what the rate of inflation is going to be, but that it's going to be less than the rate of inflation. So I just want to be clear, this isn't, as I understand it, a proposal that's actually going to be generating additional revenues from this pot of money in any significant way. It's going to offset the inflation over a longer period to some degree, if that, but it's not like this is pulling money that didn't previously exist out of a hat.
So I guess I can answer the last part of it. Perhaps it's definitely not pulling money out of a hat. And in fact, what will happen, this money currently in the past year was sitting in the overlay account and in that ATB interest account. Those two accounts, because they were not stabilization funds, that money has been invested mostly in MMDT, the Mass Municipal Depository Trust, which is where we have most of our money, where we're earning about 5.5% right now. These funds, this whole $26 million is earning 5.5% interest right now. What will happen, the reality is, when it becomes a stabilization fund, that 5.5% gets to be applied specifically to this fund. We will have, in a sense, a corresponding reduction of that same amount of interest in the general fund. So if we move this money, hopefully you will vote to move this money, because I really do think that we're putting a very solid plan in front of you. But whatever we earn for interest this year in the general fund will be less by, let's say my $975 is exactly the right number for this year. Our general fund interest earned would be $975 less. So none of this is free money. None of this is money getting pulled out of a hat.
Right.
It all comes from different places. It's money that has been earning interest before, interest that was going to the general fund. Now it would be interest that's going to the stabilization fund that helps to boost, again, what we can put.
Right. So the reason I'm emphasizing that is just because I don't want people to have the mistaken impression that somehow we're turning this pot of money into some investment powerhouse vehicle that's going to generate its own revenue. ultimately we still need to grapple with the need for additional operating revenues from some source or other, but this isn't going to solve that problem. And it sounds like the interest we're expecting on this investment is not particularly high. The return we're expecting is not particularly high. In fact, it might be, it seems like currently, at least it would be below the rate of inflation, which means in real terms, by dividing this out over 8 years, we're going to lose money on the deal. There's going to be less money in real terms at the end of this 8-year period than we started with.
So I would say I don't know that answer, Councillor Humphrey. What I have done in this forecast is tried to be very, very conservative with the interest earned so that we weren't projecting something that showed us being able to lower the pension appropriation, by more than it only being 5%. If I had been more aggressive with the interest, I would be coming to you saying, we'll only have to increase pensions by 4.8%. I didn't want to do anything like that. I wanted to make sure that I was being conservative. Where we really land with the interest, is certainly a matter to be seen.
Now, the other way that you could have chosen to boost operations through savings would be to invest this in upfront projects on both the city side and NPS side that would save money. For example, we've had to defer maintenance on a lot of roads and buildings projects because we didn't have access to this money while it was tied up legally. Had we had access to the money, it would have been going into operations and so forth. But we also know there's a lot of stuff in the city that because of deferred maintenance, things are breaking down. We're having to do emergency boiler replacements and HVAC replacements and things like that. We're not saving money year over year that we could be saving because we're not putting in money up front. So I was wondering if you could comment on that aspect, because to my mind, that would be a better way of saving the money for the city on an annual basis, would be to spend upfront over, say, a 1 to 2 year period on catch-up projects that will save us money in the long run, or transitional projects that will, insource things and save us money that way.
Thank you for that question. The biggest thing that we looked at is, so it's really, there's probably a couple of different answers to that. One would be, this is only $26 million. So what if we approached this and we looked at Lincoln Elliott School again and said, let's take this whole 26 million, let's not bond as much for Lincoln Elliott so that we have less money that we'll need for debt service next year and ad infinitum. Because we would be selling 30-year bonds, as a general rule of thumb, when I look at like an amount of money that we would be paying down or a cost of a bond, I think of it in terms of, especially now that interest rates are about 4%, I think of it in terms of it would cost us about 10% of the total of whatever we're talking about for a total amount of dollars, or conversely save us. So if we put 26 million into Lincoln Elliott, and depending on how bad the interest rates as we really begin to bond that project, we could potentially save somewhere between $2 and $2.5 million a year in debt service that we could then repurpose for everything else. The issue with that is that it's our projects like that, we bond over 30 years, so it's a much longer timeline. And it doesn't come anywhere near being amounting to what is the 7.8 by 2032. So that was one of the things that we looked at. We also talked about, do we take this money and pave more roads? We know just as much as you know that the thing people are most upset about in this city is roads. Everybody hears it. You all hear it. We hear it. What if we took a big chunk of this money and put it toward roads? We have stayed on track when we put our plan together to spend $9.5 million a year on paving and traffic calming. We have actually stuck to that plan through all of this. Now, we used ARPA funds for a little of it. We've also put an infusion of ARPA funds into that plan. So God, we could put every bit of this 26 million into roads, and we would probably still have people complaining about roads. Doing short-term maintenance projects in our buildings, we did not look seriously at that. So what we did not do was.
Why not?
What we've done is reintroduce them in the CIP. When you get your CIP next week, what you will see is that Josh Morse actually came up with a list. I think we have 143 items that we have added to the CIP to really put a list, very comprehensive list in front of us of all of the different roof and HVAC and building envelope type of projects. We didn't think that was the best way for us to go.
Well, I mean, I understood the Lincoln Elliott plan. I supported the Lincoln Elliott plan. That was money that was flowing out of the system that represented real savings year after year and in total over decades. This plan is just moving money around internally. And I'm very surprised to hear that the administration did not look seriously at school buildings maintenance projects. If you had taken the entire $26 million and you said 100% of it to NPS, not even to roads or anything on the city side, 100% of it to NPS, you've got what you said, 140 something projects that Josh Morse came up with that are just buildings maintenance projects to catch up with our schools. I mean, we've got kids that are sweltering right now with, insufficient and, not upgraded air conditioning. They don't have the right heating systems for the winter. We're constantly having to replace broken boilers with things, right? At a great cost and great expense, doing temporary fossil fuel boilers because we haven't been able to make the switch yet to, the heat pump systems that we're looking at doing. So we've got these inefficient buildings, crumbling buildings. This is the environment without even getting into questions of personnel and any programming stuff, just in terms of maintenance, charter maintenance issues, things like that we have 140 something projects that represent very real savings that we could have had. And the administration did not look seriously at that before proposing this plan.
So if I may, I just want to clarify, these are not 143 projects that need to be done now. These are 143. What we've done is added all the roofs, all the HVAC systems. Some of these things are 10, 15, 20 years away.
I bet you could find 10 of them, though, that are, current year or next year priorities that would save us a lot of money operationally year over year.
They will not save us $7.8 million in 2032.
Do you know that? Did you check? Did you run the numbers on that? It doesn't sound like you did.
I did not run the numbers, but intuitively I know that.
Okay, I'm just pointing out that I know it's only $26 million. I know that only goes so far, but I'm just saying that there's a lot of maintenance catch-up projects on both the city side and NPS that we could have looked at that would save us significant amounts of money every year operationally. And that's without having to, even hire people on a temporary basis for, in-house stuff. There's other things we could have looked at as well that could save money by moving various city services that are currently outsourced in-house. I know that there's pension costs associated with that and things like that you probably didn't want to deal with, but those are things that we could have, taken money and done upfront one-time expenditures to switch how we're doing things in a way that's saving money over the long term. And that could be for any department that somebody considers to be a priority. Yes, we can't do all of the projects we'd like to do because it's only $26 million, but there's a lot we could do with this. And instead, we've got an 8-year plan of promises, not commitments, because you can't commit things over that long of a period legally, right? And I know that discussion has already been had, right? And there's going to be a different mayor for at least part of that period. We know that, right? So it's a little bit strange. And then to have it invested in a low return way, because yes, that's very safe and secure. I get that, but a low return way in a high inflation environment where this is going to end up being in real terms, less money at the end of the 8 years than we started with, because the money is the most valuable now and it's going to get less valuable over time, no matter what. And it's certainly going to get less valuable with inflation, but even without inflation, the revenues are going to go up and everything's going to go up, right? So it's going to be less. We know it's going to be less. And if it's a low return, then it's definitely going to be less money in real terms if not, obviously you're projecting it out to be nominally higher, but in real terms, it's going to be less. So this isn't, this is a very complicated plan, and it's not the best use of this funding. And I think that you didn't really ask the city councilors for their input on this. You ran it by a few councilors right before you announced it, but you didn't ask for input or suggestions on some of this stuff. And that's what you're even telling us right now, is that essentially you hadn't really thought about some of the potential options here. Thank you.
If I may, Madam Chair, I don't want people to think that we didn't think about things. I absolutely firmly believe that the plan that we've put in front of you is the best of the alternatives that we felt were before us. We think this will provide the greatest benefit to the city, and really stand by this proposal. And I know there are other people could have come up with other plans. There always are other things that people could do when we have this type of I don't want to call it a problem, a situation where we have funds to use. Every one of us could have come up with a different plan. So I don't want to say that anyone's plan wouldn't be a good plan, but in our opinion, this was the best plan that we felt that we should bring before you.
Councillor Norton, then Oliver.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Ms. Lemieux, for this explanation. To me, it seems reasonable to the extent that I can wrap my mind around it. I'd love to get a copy of the slides. I don't know if that's something that Mr. Curley or Mr. Cudmore can provide for us. That would be great. And do you have a sense of what you had talked about what the percentage increase in funding for the schools would be at the end of this time period? Is it possible to know what it would be in the interim? I'm curious on the school side and the city side, if you have those numbers.
Those numbers are all in the financial forecast that we provided last week. We have them split so you can see exactly what the NPS appropriation would be at a 3.5% increase each year for the next 8 years. Then on the next line, we have the exact corresponding number that would be 70% of this plan. And then we show the total. When we get to fiscal 32, so in fiscal 32, their total would be $5.5 million more than it would be if we only increase by the 3.5%. In fiscal 33, the intent would be to take that base with the $5.5 million as part of it, and then increase that by 3.5%.
So those numbers you're referring to take into account this stabilization plan?
Yes.
Okay.
Everything that we put in the forecast, our gap, everything takes into account this plan. And you can see it broken out very specifically on all the line items when we have any tables in the forecast, so that people will be able to see very clearly where we would be using the funds.
Okay. And is there an opportunity to use any of these funds, or is that part of what Josh's additional projects are? It sounds like we're not really looking to apply this toward additional one-time projects besides the school ones that you referenced. I personally would like to see a study of the city's flood vulnerability, and I did suggest that to the mayor, but I don't know if are there going to be opportunities to suggest additional items to use the one-time funds?
We will not be looking at this 26 million as being one-time funds. So we would put it all into this stabilization fund. It would be generating interest. It would be getting pulled out each year. The 30%, at least right now in how we have it all structured, just drops to the gap. Whether or not over time free cash remains strong, we would certainly use to look free cash, as always, for one-time funds. Further declarations of overlay surplus, we would hopefully be in a position to use those for good one-time funds. A flood analysis or plan for the city, I would tend to think ought to come out of stormwater. We're working very hard trying to figure out what the MS4 permit and the NIPDES permit will require for us. We have our phosphorus control plan we'll be putting a lot of effort into. And so things like understanding where the flood prone areas, even though I think we all understand them, how do we solve them with the tremendous rains that we've had lately? I think that's an issue that has really become front of mind for a lot of people. We understand all of that. We're trying to, we constantly try to look at all of the different issues and figure out which ones really need to move forward.
Okay, no, thank you. We don't have all the data we need for that, and I won't take up people's time now, but I will continue to try to press the administration to spend the funds on that. Thank you.
Councillor Oliver, then Noel.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
All right, great. Using a new microphone here, so you never really know, but good. So I think Councillor Humphrey asked some really good questions there. And I do appreciate the candid answers. I am curious, like in the chart we were looking at a few minutes ago, it's clear that the initial deposit would be $26 million. What I'm curious about is great, thank you. Where on here do we see the total that is ultimately extracted from that account, given the interest accumulation over the 8 or 9 fiscal years? I'm just curious.
So in the third section, you can see what the beginning balance would be. 26,013. As you recall, I just said that we had 5,513,000 in the interest fund. So we'd start with 26,013 in year 1, which is fiscal 24. We have 9 months worth of interest at I think it's 4.5%, could be 5. I forget now. We used what we were getting, what we had for Fed projections. A week ago, I could have told you to the penny what we had in these line items. The following year in 25, so in that same section, so we would be starting fiscal 25 with a beginning balance of 26,988. We would put 659 toward the pension funding. So in our budget, you would see the pension would be funded, if you look up above, funding the pensions at 6.6. So if you start at the top of that column, at 6.6, we need to have 43,964 as the funding schedule. If we are putting in 5% from our, as a budgeted general fund number and taking the difference of the 1.6 that year, it's $659,000. So if you look down below, we would take out 659 from the fund, and then for the rest of fiscal 25, we would earn $1,058,000. We've even been so detailed in these calculations that we typically pay our pension funding amount. We transfer the funds around August 1st. So I have a month of interest being beforehand. We've even calculated all of that once we take out the 659, then we have 11 months earning that year's interest. So then we would end that year with the 27.3. We go to fiscal 26. The difference between so now we're 2 years into only increasing the general fund increase, if you will, by 5%. So 2 years of 1.6 less, we would need $1,396,000 to cover that. That's what we would take out of the fund. So we tried to put this together so that people could track really down to the dollar what our intent would be.
Right. It's so.
I hope that helps.
I may need to ask that question slightly differently. The total amount that goes in is $26 million at the front end. There's some amount of interest, like we see here, right? That third, in the third bucket, the third line item.
Yes.
Right? Looking at the 2025 forecast, it's $1,058,642, right? So the total amount that comes out of this account
is about 31 something. I think we have about $5 million worth of interest.
That's the number. Okay, great. So theoretically, I should be able to add up that second row in the third group or bucket of numbers, and that's the 31-ish million.
Exactly.
Okay. All right. Helpful. I appreciate that. And a minute ago, again, kind of going back to the conversation that Councilor Humphrey was the questions he was asking. Sorry. If there were more interest to be earned in any given year along, within this continuum, and I realize, and I think I heard Councilor Humphrey say this, but I just want to make sure. What is the current intent? We can't guarantee it, but if for some reason we end up with a spike like we just talked about a few minutes ago when it came to free cash, those dollars would go where?
Those dollars, because this would be a stabilization fund, any interest we earn on these funds will go right back to this fund. So what we would do is increase so that, $5+ million, whatever it is that we earn in interest, that line would increase. What would hopefully happen is that my hope is that we will earn more interest. We're being conservative with this. My hope is that we will earn more interest. And then, so when we get to years, I don't know, 28, 29, fiscal 30, whatever year this would happen, if all of a sudden we knew we had more interest, then instead of, but we would want to plan it out for the rest of time, because I wouldn't want to have a big hit to the budget, say in fiscal 21 or 31 or 32. So we would look at it, figure out where we are with how much interest we've earned, and then perhaps lower for a year how much we have to increase the general fund budget. So maybe we don't have to increase it by 5% for the rest of time. Maybe it's 4.9, maybe it's 4.8. So the goal would always be to deplete this fund, to use as much interest as we can gain over the course of time to soften the increases associated with getting to full funding for the pensions.
Okay. So then some of the other stabilization funds kind of have stipulations in them, right? Guidelines. Here's what thou shalt do, so to speak. Is that same 70-30 split going to apply across time or over time then? Ish? Or not ish. 70-30 split to whatever funds end up being earned in interest.
So what I would say to you is that is certainly our intent in coming to you with this proposal. I would hope that if the council really approves this this initiative or plan or proposal or whatever we want to call it, there are 24 of you. I will not be here, I don't think, when we finally get this pension plan fully funded. However, many of you will be here over the years. I don't know how many of us will be sitting if we're still Zooming in 2032, but I would hope that the council and that any mayor to come would recognize that this is a plan that we all put in place together, and would hopefully think it was a good plan. Because if someone didn't, so if a mayor came along, or really a mayor, because they're the ones who propose things, came along and said, I'm not giving the schools their money this year, then what do we do? Then obviously as a council, I would think you would all have plenty of opinions. That mayor would still need to figure out how they were going to get a 6.6% increase in the pension appropriation. Yeah. So this is really, I view it more or less as a gift to whoever the mayor would be and whoever the council will be, that we have this plan that really does stabilize things and helps us to do what we need to do operationally, or help us, a bit more. I mean, it's, we live under Proposition 2.5. That doesn't change. But I think this plan really helps us to soften the impact of increasing the pension. Mm-hmm. So I would think and hope that any future mayor and any future council would look at this, and say, wow, I'm really glad that those people back in 2023 had the foresight to set this up. That would be my goal.
Okay. And then just one last thought, and this may end up being a rhetorical question at this point in time. But the idea that we are not solving some very near-term challenges in the school buildings, at the very least, is troubling, I think, is an easy way to, perhaps an understatement there. Opinion of one or two, perhaps, here tonight. But I am curious if there have been conversations, right? 143 new items added to the CIP, significant number of those attached to different school buildings, school properties, that sort of thing, upkeep, maintenance, improvements. Granted, those are, not in front of us right now, and they can't be, because we don't know what's been certified. I would certainly hope that the administration is looking to, at the very least, prioritize those school buildings that are not up to snuff, right? Let's get the heat, let's get the AC working, let's get these kids in a comfortable, safe learning environment. Maybe I'm proselytizing here a little bit, because I know this, now that I'm kind of saying it out loud, there's no way to answer this question right now. But OMG, I really am looking forward to seeing that front and center when it comes to free cash allocations or requests. But thank you very much. I do appreciate it. And thank you, Madam Chair. That's all for me.
Madam Chair, if I may, there's just a quick response I would love to give to Councillor Oliver, because I will tell you, back probably in 2014 now, and I'm sure there are plenty of people who are on the screen who were around back then. The kids that went to the Cabot School were, the HVAC system was terrible. And even though we knew the override passed in 2013, but we knew we wouldn't be opening that new school until probably 2019. We actually were, with our fabulous buildings department, we stayed on track, and we did get that building opened in September of 19. But we knew that there were kids who were going to spend their entire elementary education in that building before we were going to open the new one. And we ended up putting in, I think it was a boiler, and we did some HVAC work, because we knew we will never purposely or knowingly have kids who are in buildings that are really inappropriate. So anything that becomes an emergency, we've certainly made it a point to come to you all immediately to fix things. We can't fix all of the, we have.
I don't know, Ms. Leo. I was going to wait I'm definitely going to wait my turn, but on that one, I don't know. I mean, the stories that have come out of the last few days and the situation we're in, to me, the reality is we're in dire straits on both fronts, from a building and a maintenance perspective and a personnel perspective, but I'll come back to it in a second. Okay. I understand that.
I'll accept that.
Most desperate emergencies have been addressed, but I mean, here we are, speaking about plans of mayors. When I became a counselor, and even up 5 years prior than that, according to the long-range plan that was put in place by the prior mayor, we were supposed to have a brand new ward school open with kids moving in 2023. Here we are, we're not one step closer to, a new building. And I don't know. I just have a really tough time swallowing where we're at with respect to both of these things, to be honest. And I'm very supportive of this plan, so I'll talk about that in a minute. I just think it's important that we acknowledge that for a really significant portion of our of our kids and our staff and all the folks who work really hard in our buildings, we're in tough shape. Let me go to Councillor Noel, and I will certainly come back to you, and you can share as much as you want, Ms. Lemieux, but at that point, I just had to say something.
Okay.
Councillor Noel.
Thank you. I appreciate your comments, Councillor Grossman. So I just want to take a step back because I do feel like we got here really quickly. So one of the things that was exciting when Mayor Fuller got elected is that she was from the council and that there was this idea that there was going to be more collaboration between the mayor's office and the councilors. When Mayor Fuller proposed the override plan, she came to councilors and she very specifically told us that this was what was going to be best for the city. This is what was going to be needed for the city. And it was our job to advocate. And several of us used significant political capital, time, and resources to push the override plan forward and partner with the mayor in the override plan, believing in that override plan and believing in the ideas that this mayor had. I am absolutely frustrated that that we're partners when we can provide a service, and when the override didn't come through and there's this financial windfall, it's bestowed upon us with some framework that it's a gift, that future councilors can't be trusted, future mayors can't be trusted, and that at some point, I think what you just said is you're going to be thanked down the road. That actually just kind of doesn't resonate well with me. It seems like a certain level of arrogance that this is one perspective, this is one plan, and Councillor Humphrey offered an alternative interpretation of it. I'm not saying he's right, but I'm not saying this plan's right, and I think there's more work to be done, more tires to be kicked on this. And I am, what you hear in my voice is that this wasn't collaborative, and I know you don't need to respond that the mayor runs the city. I get it. But the mayor doesn't have a problem asking for our help when she needs it. So I would love if maybe she could ask for our thoughts, since we are boots on the ground in the community. So I was elected 6 years ago. I will not be here to see the fruition of this plan. But I will tell you, if you were to ask my Ward 6 constituents, are they better off today or 6 years ago or 5 years ago, let's just say, or 4 years ago? They're going to say 4 years ago, when we are pulling back on Pneumo. Mason Rice is in terrible shape. Take a ride down Dunkley Road. You wouldn't even believe that you were in an advanced community. The road is so terrible. We lost understanding our differences. This is low-lying fruit. The things that make our community special and amazing and a wonderful place to live are evaporating. And the things that impact our citizens every day, I think, again, if there was an opportunity to collaborate on this plan, or at least provide some feedback, I may have suggested that we split the difference a little bit and get some of our services back. Because as Councillor Grossman said, things are not good out there. And selling to our constituents that we're going to pay back OPEB quicker may not be top of mind. So you heard some frustration in my voice. I think that there's more work to be done, more things to consider on this plan. But I think it's very disheartening to me as I end my term here that in some ways my constituents are worse off today than they were 4 years ago. And that's very disappointing.
So I guess it's my turn, unless Ms. Lemieux, I don't know if you want to say anything. Okay. So taking a step back, to me, this plan has a lot of logic to it. I don't dispute that there are infinite plans that one could propose that would all have great value to the city. I certainly don't dispute Councillor Humphrey's point that maintenance and buildings and the state of things there is a huge problem. However, when I think about where this plan came from, I go back to where we were last spring as we were working through what we were doing with our pension appropriations and at budget time. And as I'm sure a lot of you will remember, I participated along with a small group of other councilors and a school committee member in taking a look at our pension appropriation. And we were really pushing to get close to something like a 5% rate of growth in the pension appropriation for really exactly the purpose that this plan is proposing, which is freeing up a greater source of cash flows between now and the time that we reach full funding of the pension appropriation to be able to pay for more city services. And different councilors had different views of what those city services would be. For me, it was always about NPS and getting more money to NPS. And once we got through the pension appropriation section of things in the budget, Councillor Gentile and I were then looking at these different sources of cash that were around in various accounts in the city, and independently brainstormed this type of a fund idea. I think he and I each had different potential ideas of what we might do with the money, but this idea of somehow trying to convert one-time funds into a longer source stream of revenue to be able to close some of these gaps so that we could keep some things that we were otherwise getting rid of. I'm sure many of you will remember, for me, I was talking about things like kindergarten aides and middle school teachers. And that's still what's on my mind. You know, the school committee, of course, if this plan goes through, is going to have the authority to say what they do with these different funds. But what the mayor has proposed here, to my mind, I appreciate that she listened to the discourse and the discussions that we were having then. And I know not everybody agreed with those concepts back then. And they were really brainstorms then, not a fully formed plan. But in general, directionally, what's put together here makes sense to me. I do have a couple questions. So the first is about the legal constraints on the fund and the legal level of control, and the idea of what future mayors and city councils may or may not be able to do, because I know that there has been concern out there. And when we're talking about the stabilization fund and putting this money into it, Ms. Lemieux, I'm sure you know this, but I actually haven't heard the answers to this. What are the constraints on what can happen to this money from here? So like, if we approve it and the mayor, forget even a future mayor, let's say the mayor changes her mind in 2 years and doesn't want to spend it this way anymore. Is that an option? Or is this money at this point, if it's approved, guaranteed to go to these sources that we're talking about today?
If this money is approved, the utilization of this fund will come back through the city council for anything. So the mayor would not have the authority to do anything with it. So if everything goes according to what we've laid out, the mechanics, when we would put next year's budget together, you would see in the expenditure lines for the retirement account that's under the comptroller's office, you would see the 6.6% increase there. Within the revenues, when you approve the budget, much in the same way that you approved the 1.5 million that we use of free cash every year to put toward the budget, this next year's $659,000 would be listed as a revenue source that you would approve. If the mayor went completely rogue 2 years from now and didn't want to do anything with this, and I don't know, do something else entirely, it couldn't get spent without city council approval.
But it's not as though there are legal constraints in place automatically on this money by virtue of a vote today or imminently by the council that makes it so that this money is only used for this purpose, period. Is that accurate?
I don't believe so. But as I say, it would have to go through the council. I don't know if our comptroller has either a different opinion or the same one as me, but I don't think technically that this is locked up to do this. But if it were to be used to do anything else, the city council would have to approve it.
Mr. Curley, I don't know if you want to comment on that. I just want to make sure that we're all really understanding this. I've definitely been asked this question, and I think from the school side of things, they also need to know if they can really count on this money going forward. So that's really what I'm trying to get at, is what could go wrong?
So good evening. As Ms. Lemieux mentioned, every action for this stabilization fund needs to come, recommendation of the mayor and vote by the city council. And I forget off the top of my head, I was actually starting to look it up, but I believe it's 2/3 vote to establish the stabilization fund and 3/4 vote to do anything with the funds from council once the fund is established. And the fund has to, if it is established, it must remain open for 3 years before it could be closed. So if the mayor decided next year she didn't want the stabilization fund, it would still remain for 3 years. I think with it being an operations booster stabilization fund, the intent would be it's assisting in the, essentially transferring in funds to assist in the operations of the city, increasing that budget. But again, if the mayor doesn't put that forward in her budget, I don't think there's any language in the stabilization fund laws under Mass General Law that would force that to happen. So I think the money would just sit in the stabilization fund earning interest at that point.
Could the mayor close the fund after 3 years on her own, or does that require city council approval as well?
I'm almost certain that requires city council approval, but I can look it up and try and get an answer in a few.
That would be great. Could you also just, I don't know if you can give us some examples off the top of your head. What are some other stabilization funds that we are routinely using and approving in the budget process that we're not even thinking about on an annual basis and just work this way, but it doesn't really come top of mind because it hasn't been an issue of controversy?
So the city only has the rainy day stabilization fund and the capital stabilization fund, neither of which support the day-to-day operations of the city. The rainy day, as you know, they put a percentage in each year to maintain 5% of the budget, and the interest on the fund goes into that rainy day stabilization. The capital stabilization fund is usually when public buildings will come for typically an energy efficiency item, capital item in nature, and they will ask to appropriate funds from there for, I know they've done it for like a windows or roof type project. I believe there was an HVAC last year, but no stabilization funds affect the operations of the city in the general fund operating budget.
Do you happen to know the balance of the capital stabilization fund, or is that something you can look up when you have a second?
I can look it up.
Okay, I'm curious about that. So it's not as though there are any legal documents or legal constraints that our city solicitor will be putting together that limit what the use of these funds could be. So essentially, and I'm not saying this is a criticism, I'm just saying this to understand. We're essentially relying on the mayor's word of this plan that this is her intent of how to spend the money between now and the time that the pension is fully funded. Is that a fair statement, Ms. Lemieux?
Yes, except the larger question that I have of Mr. Curley is the votes. I think we need to make sure that we know that everybody knows how many votes are required. Whether it's to establish it or to take money out. So statutorily, there are rules around the stabilization fund. But I think beyond that, there aren't specific rules for this one stabilization fund, if that makes sense.
Okay. And Mr. Curley, if you do find that information as we're going through this discussion, that would be helpful. Ms. Lee, let me ask. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Sorry, I just found the capital stabilization balance is 392,000 and some change. The stabilization fund needs a 2/3 vote to create and a 2/3 vote. It looks like a 2/3 vote for both, from what I see, which is. It's a bit old, so I'm going to see if anything's changed with the Modernization Act. But
Is that somewhere in the Mass General Laws, or what's the source that you're looking at there?
yes, this is a DLS information guideline release, but it's old. It was the first state document that I found. But I will look at the general laws as well.
Okay, so I think fair to say also that our city solicitor should probably be looking at that. Ms. Lemieux, would you agree? I just am wondering if I could charge the two of you, Ms. Lemieux and Mr. Curley, to make sure that we have clarity around this.
Yes.
Certainly.
Okay, great. Okay, some numbers questions. So I certainly recall about a year ago, June, so I guess that would be June 2022-ish. We set aside the 4.6 million in Eversource interest in a separate account. And I also recall that there was sort of a duplicate of that 4.6 million sitting in the overlay world. If you could remind me, Ms. Lemieux, because you mentioned the 4.6 million. I want to make sure I understand which 4.6 million we're talking about, because I remember that one bucket of 4.6 million in June 22 was put aside in a totally separate account. Is that account called into question here, or does that account continue to exist after should this be approved after this is approved?
So the 4.6 million is the bulk of that ATB interest account. So that 5.5 million that we're talking about, 4.6 of it is what we moved there. It was never in the overlay account.
So I thought we put it in its own separate account. I don't remember putting it in the ATB interest account. Maybe that is
yes.
the legal effect of what we did.
That is what we did. So we had been carrying about 800,000 in there for years. It was a leftover amount from some declaration of overlay surplus soon after we had the issue where, and it was probably in about 2013, where we needed to come up with like $600,000 for Verizon for interest in a case that we lost. And that was still back when we had to have separate overlay for every year. So we didn't have a place to go and find that 600,000. So we had to take it out of free cash. After that, we created this ATB interest and penalties account just in case we lost some other case, where we had to pay, where someone had been paying their taxes the whole time. We owed them back their principal and then owed them interest on their taxes. That's what that ATB account was. So that was set up probably back around like 2013. The 4.6 million that Eversource gave us in interest, we moved to that account.
Okay. I also want to make 100% certain that we have all of the transfers correct in whatever the proposed council order for this would be. And it sounds to me like we probably do, but I just remember the designation of the account a little differently. And that's why I just wanted to be 100% certain that we're talking about the right account.
Yes.
Next question. I understand that we've already had this money certified by the Board of Assessors to come out of the overlay account. With that now behind us and that designation made, what is now the current balance of the overlay account?
It is about 11 million.
Okay. And in your view, is that about what it should be? Or are we still carrying a healthier amount there than is typical?
It's very close to where it ought to be. There are always ebbs and flows in that account. So I actually went over this very specifically with Jim Shaughnessy, our chief assessor, to make sure that I understood what we are carrying for some of the appeals versus what the potential exposure could be. So when we get to this point, we don't always carry the full amount of what someone is contesting. They do a lot of analysis and try to figure out what could we really be on the hook for. And so we went through all of the different accounts. I think that we are really in the right place for right now.
Yeah. So I know there's 2 more Eversource cases out there. How much of the money in there is associated with the remaining 2 Eversource cases?
Not a lot, because we have been, we believe they are going to drop those cases. So we didn't keep much in there for those. So part of the 20.5 million is recognizing that we are fully expecting those cases to go away. I don't know. I don't think we've received notification yet, but it is our expectation that those will go away.
Okay. And then in terms of the interest income going forward, I know that you projected interest rates to come down when you put together this fund, but obviously we've had a really significant amount accrue to what we expect to be certified free cash this year. How, and we already approved a budget for what we think projected interest income is going to be for fiscal year 24. Looking at where we're at for fiscal year 24, where do you think the interest income variance is going to be in the fiscal year that we're in? I mean, how much? I think it's probably fair to assume we're going to be above whatever you budgeted for. And then how are you thinking about projecting that line for our fiscal year 25 budget and the next few years after that?
Okay, great question. So in the fiscal 24 budget, because we put this together 6 months ago now, we only had 2.5 million as a budgeted number for interest income. So I would anticipate, based on how everything has been going, at least up to this point, that we would have a very healthy variance in our actuals to what we budgeted. So, hopefully we will land again in the $9 million range. But if we put this fund together, like I said a few minutes ago, the 975,000 would have been baked into last year's 9 million. So assume that it would be $1 million less in the general fund, because $1 million would land in the stabilization fund. So if all things were equal this coming year, our 9 million would translate to 8 million next year. But I would expect, based on everything as we know it at the moment, that we will have a significant favorable variance. When I put the forecast together for next year, and again, you will be able to see this in your forecast that we handed out, because we specifically called out this line, interest income, in the fiscal 25 forecast, and in hopefully what I will be budgeting is 4.5 million for interest income for next year. When you look at that slide that showed our 15 years worth of income, you can see that other than last year, we have never hit $4.5 million. So that is about as far out on that limb as I am going to be looking to go, because what we can't do is have ourselves dependent on something that we think is a revenue stream that is not going to last. So we have to be very, very careful with how we budget it. But in the fiscal 25 budget, I think I'm going with 4.5 million. And then in the forecast, you can see I have it decreasing by, $500,000 a year for a few years, and then more or less stabilizing at 2.5 million. But it is in your forecasts. And I just don't want to get too aggressive, because we can't rely on that as if it's a, going to be a future funding source at that level.
Appreciate that. It's particularly interesting because, of course, last year we had an abnormally high amount of free cash. This year we're projected to have an abnormally high amount of free cash. It is possible we could have yet another year like that next year if our interest income produces as much as you just talked about. And while I appreciate that you've mentioned different legal settlements and other emergency needs for some of the free cash that we carried over, we're still projected to carry a healthier balance than we would typically have. and you know that we're going to put to work in a certain way, like snow removal and the road paving and things like that. So I think it's fair to say we'll all be watching with interest exactly where those free cash numbers land and what the administration proposes to do with it. And I think it's also just, it's an interesting question. We've been asked a lot over the last few weeks in this process of, are we budgeting too conservatively and not putting enough money to work when we have it, and then having this free cash amount generate? I think you've explained really well why we're at where we're at. And I hope that we're in a position that we have more money that we can spend and put to work, but something that I'm looking at and thinking about. Mr. Curley, let me come to you, and then Councillor Kalis, you're next.
Thank you. So I looked up, it's Chapter 40, Section 5B for the establishment of stabilization funds. It requires 2/3 vote to create one and to use the funds in one. It also requires 2/3 vote to change the purpose of the fund. And within the general law, it says at the time of creating any stabilization fund, the city, town, or district shall specify and at any later time may alter the purpose of the fund, which may be for any lawful purpose. So I think part of that would be how specific, wide or narrow the stabilization fund is built as it makes its way through council.
Okay, so then if I could put it back, Ms. Lemieux, to you and Mr. Curley to provide that information again to our city solicitor. Let's make sure that whatever your proposed purpose is established either through what you've already provided us or some sort of a supplemental statement.
We will certainly do that. And I would think that, I don't know, did you get a proposed board order yet with your agenda? Because
normally we do, yes.
So I think we would want to take a look at that.
It does, and it does have some language in here. But I don't know if it says quite enough. So why don't you take a look at it? It's in the last page of our packet right now.
Okay.
Councillor Kalis, I had said you were next. I don't know if you have a quick thing or a long thing, because just Councillor Malky hasn't spoken yet, but I did say you're next. So why don't you go ahead?
I have a long thing, so I'll let Councillor Malky go.
Okay. All right. Then assuming we don't have any new hands, I will come to you, and then Councillor Humphrey after that. Councillor Malky, you're up.
Yeah, thank you. I'll maybe be quick. Just to clarify, because we got a fair number of emails from people concerned about present circumstances, and Councillor Chair Grossman, you had examples too. Was there no way to start the benefits, whatever period of time you're running it over, start the benefits in FY24? Was that just not practical?
Well, we've already established the budgets for 24, and that specifically is why I put that list in tonight, so that you could see all of the different things that we did to make the fiscal 24 budget work, as well as the school department has carried forward. They initially thought they were going to have a $2 million carry forward. I want to say that they ended up having about 3.2 million as a carry forward. So we didn't think that doing anything for 24 was appropriate, but wanted to certainly start in 25.
Okay, and I know you said you projected the interest conservatively, but if for any reason interest rates did not meet expectations, sort of at what point would you kind of readjust the plan going forward, and what form would that take? Would you be going back to more of the 6.5% pension increase coming out of the city budget instead of trying to keep up the 1.5% coming from this fund?
So I think if that were the case, it would probably be in tenths of percentages that we would need to adjust. So if interest rates completely fell apart, if you look at our chart, I don't know if Perry can pull it up again. When we get out to the outer years, and you know, we certainly have a sense of where interest rates are right now. But if we can go to that, how the utilization of the fund, Perry. Thank you. Okay, so if you look at, you know, what we have as interest earned, when we get out from 2029 and beyond, we are assuming only 471,029 drops to 354 in 30, 203 in 31, and 16,000 in 32. If it became clear that we weren't going to be earning that type of interest, I could certainly envision, I mean, all of that together is only about $1 million. I could envision the city, you know, mayor and city councilors at that time, perhaps either taking $1 million from free cash to put it into this fund to make sure that we can stay at the 5%, or perhaps looking at it and saying, well, instead of it being 5.0, maybe it needs to be 5.1 or 5.15. Because the model has us relying on small amounts of interest the further out we go. I think there would be a couple of different options if the interest rates completely were not there. But as I said, we tried to be pretty conservative.
Okay, and last question. So Mr. Curley said it takes a 2/3 vote of the city council to spend the money. So I would not expect following the plan would be controversial. But if there was any future disagreement, there's the possibility that the funds for a particular year could just sit there and carry over.
Well, I've just pulled up the board order. What I would think we will want to do is work with the city solicitor's office and perhaps get a little bit more language in this board order.
But we're constrained by the state law with regard to the 2/3, I guess.
Yes, but the whole key will be making sure that the purpose, at least from what I understood, Mr. Curley, just reading, it sounds like if we really make sure that the purpose is tight enough, then a mayor couldn't just decide not to do something. We'll work with the law department and see how tight we can get this so that if you all approve it, that you're approving something that really will be able to take effect.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Kalis-Humphrey.
Thank you, Chair. So Ms. Lemieux, kind of building on what Councillor Malachy just talked about, but also I want to get back to what other councillors have said. The budget being set as it is, and all the money given to the schools and the allocations elsewhere being what they are and as generous as they are, I think that's fine. But I think what you're hearing actually is that the council wants a say on what's appropriate for the budget. And what I heard from Councillor Noel, it was really a different tone in her voice that I've heard. But she was really expressing the frustration that we're hearing from residents and in different walks, you know, whether it's transportation or schools. I mean, I think Councillor Humphrey talked talked a lot about the schools, as did Oliver. But the capturing of that frustration, I think, is very interesting. And decisions like these are never going to be 100%. They're not going to be easy. Everybody's going to have their own opinion. What I kind of want to know, though, and what I think is appropriate is in what Councillor Noel brought up was talking about how much money is included in the fund and how it's spent. I mean, you talked about the 26 million, but you could have structured it differently. The 20.5 could go into that fund, and that 5.5 from the ATB could be spent this year. Would you be open to the council, maybe a few of us here in finance, coming back to you, understanding that cliff funding in any way of one-time funds would be completely rejected. But if the committee had a unified suggestion on how to structure this, maybe spending some of it this year and the rest of it going for the stabilization fund, would you and the mayor listen?
I would say, first of all, Councillor Kalis, we would always be happy to listen to anything that you would want to bring forward. Whether or not in the end we would agree with it, I don't know. Because I can tell you, when we started this process, when we knew that the Board of Assessors was going to declare maybe as much as 20, I don't even think we knew it would be that high when we started having the conversations. I can tell you that I had said to the mayor a few times, oh, I hope it's more than that so that we can really impact what we are doing here. If we take any of this money, doesn't matter which amount, if we had to rerun the model and we only start with 20 million and we take 6 million and do something else fabulous with it, when we only then have 20 million that's earning interest and able to be spread out over those 8 years. And so that decision may very well impact, say, 20, 31, and 32 by a couple of $1 million each, with what we can give for sustainable budget increases, particularly to the school department. The schools are really driving the way that we are proposing this to you. So if we use any of the money up front, and I completely hear what everybody is saying, it just gives us less. So instead of having a 5% increase, it might need to be 5.5% or 5.7% or 6%. I don't know what the answers are now, but I kept running those numbers, I can assure you, when we were coming up with this plan. Yeah, so it's everything is a balancing act.
Yeah, I totally.
So I hear you. I hear you.
And what you're saying makes total sense. It's just, I have to say, Councillor Noel, you probably didn't even mean this, but it really kind of, when she was talking more about the emotional impact and the emotional needs of the city, it hit me that sometimes in finance, we're just black and white talking about numbers. And it's great that we are creating a better place for ourselves from a numbers standpoint in the future. But what can we do also? Even if we take 70% of that and create that better future from a finance standpoint, but 30% that might be able to say, okay, we want to fix some of the needs right now. To me, that's a balance as well. And I mean, that's the same balance you're talking about, but I think we're missing that. And that's what I got out of this conversation. And I don't know, Councillor Grossman, if we actually talk within committee, it's totally about what our priorities might be and how we would spend, just to see if we could come up with a unified suggestion, if people agree with the way I'm thinking about it. And if they don't, that's fine too. But I just wanted to throw this out there.
If people want to do that, we can certainly do it. I think we would have to do it in committee, I don't see a legally appropriate way to have that conversation or achieve consensus outside of
I agree.
So if there's committee interest in that, we can certainly talk about it and proceed as everybody would like.
I'd love to hear what other people think.
Councillor Humphrey and then Councillor Noel.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I certainly appreciate Councillor Kalis's remarks just now, essentially re-summarizing the essay that I put out a few weeks ago on this proposal, which is, as Councillor Noel said, based on our experiences and certainly my experience during the override door knocking, that we can't separate the politics from the numbers. And as I expressed in a meeting with the mayor a couple weeks ago, that every financial decision we're making right now has to be geared toward what is going to move the public opinion and restore public morale and confidence in the city in order to be able to pass the things we need to pass, whether it's increases in the commercial tax base or whether it's an actual operating override. We need to get the public on board with giving us additional permanent operating revenues, because we know, as members of this finance committee, or at least a majority of the finance committee agrees on this point, that we have a shortfall in permanent revenues relative to our expenses and rising costs. And what we need to be doing right now is restoring public confidence in order to have the public back us on these controversial efforts to get more permanent long-term revenue. And this is a potential source of money to move that needle. Now, going back to an earlier different discussion, Madam Chair, you were asking, posing some questions about the legal language here and ways of legally framing what can and can't be done. I think that was a really good point to bring up. So as I read it, and as I understand it from what we've heard, the proposed legal purpose of this stabilization fund would be pensions spending, not school spending. The only school spending associated with the plan is a promise outside of the legal directives on the fund to use the savings associated with the pensions appropriations. It is probably not possible legally to bind the funding to schools through two layers of abstraction. This is a pensions proposal, not a schools proposal, despite the rhetoric that we're hearing around this. If it were a schools proposal, the fund, I think, would just be set up to go directly to that, and we would just continue using operations funding elsewhere for pensions without this extra detour. So this is not a schools funding plan, despite what we've been hearing. This is a pensions funding plan that might, through the grace of whoever is the mayor in future and future city councils, have some ancillary benefits to the schools if everyone follows through on that. And there's not, as Councillor Malachy pointed out, a very real possibility of having one particular year where nobody can agree on anything, right? So besides this incomplete board order language, I think we should not vote this out of committee tonight. Certainly, I don't think we were going to, but specifically also because we keep hearing councilors on this finance committee saying that they don't understand the plan or trying to get their heads around the plan. I think that's fair, but it's also fairly compelling evidence that we need more time to work through this and digest it. And it also just doesn't seem like this has been explained very well to everyone's satisfaction. I have a pretty good idea of what's in this plan, but even I have some questions remaining, I think, as I just expressed. But I think certain other councilors have said quite openly, and I think other members outside of this committee have said quite openly, that they don't feel they understand the mechanics of this plan, even if they're inclined to support it, probably. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Councillor Noel.
I was thinking about responding. I don't want to pivot from Councillor Humphrey's remarks because there's a lot to take in there, but just in response to Councillor Kalis's remarks, one of the things that I'm thinking about in terms of process is, some of the things that have been said tonight, like the legality, the binding of this plan, the idea of going with a 30-70 split. I don't know how we're going to bring this to a full council vote without bringing the full council along, because, and I know we have a big council, I know there's 24 of us, but it seems like this should be a committee of the whole discussion, because we're going to be kicking this around, and and go through our process. And I don't know how we could expect the full council who aren't here to vote on this. I mean, obviously it would end up on second call, but I feel like people need to be brought along on this. Wherever we end up, it's been a process. So I know it's really difficult to have a conversation with 24 people, but would suggest a committee of the whole format. And if that's already been considered and there's reasons not to do it, I'd love to be educated.
Well, the only thing I'll say on that point is that to even consider having a committee of the whole discussion, there would have to be a vote out of this committee one way or another. And then there would have to be a re-referral from the full council back to a committee of the whole to then debate it in a committee of the whole and come back. I'll give my own personal opinion. I personally wouldn't support sending it to a committee of the whole. Back in the spring, I thought that was an important idea when we were talking about a lot of the moving parts of the budget process and bringing everybody along. And my own view was that failed and was not terribly successful, and still didn't manage to really bring people along. And we ended up having, 24 folks who were deeply confused in constrained meetings and honestly still didn't, in my view, fully absorb and appreciate all that we were talking about. So, I do think it's a reality with 24 of us that we have a really unwieldy body, and that these more complicated financial concepts, folks who want to understand them really need to invest the time and follow along. I just personally, if the council voted for it, of course I would do it. It's just based on my experience in the spring, not something I feel enthusiastic about. Okay, so let's see where we're at. We obviously have the outstanding legal questions to address, and we're certainly not going to be able to answer those tonight. Councilor Kalus, you just had your hand up. Did you want to speak further?
Yeah, if I could, I agree with you. I think we should work it through here, and I think we should there's 5 of us, I think, that are engaged in this conversation. I think others are at another meeting or something, or 6 of us here now.
Right.
If you don't agree with, there we go. If you don't agree with what I kind of articulated, that's fine. But, I would throw out that 4 million go to some of those 140 projects for the schools, because that's not cliff vesting. That's not cliff. That's small projects that need to get done. And, just as something to throw out there. And then, I'm open to hear what other people think, because I've heard a lot of support for something to do with the schools. I know that we've talked about Pneumo. I don't know how we get around that being a cliff situation, so I'm not going there. But if there are other ideas, like if we could come up with a 21 million going to the booster fund, 5 million going to spending this year, and we're together on that, and then we ask Ms. Lemieux to go back and run the numbers at that, maybe there's an opportunity for us to do something here. Otherwise, I think there's not. And we'll discuss it again on Thursday, either vote it up or down, and that's it. But I'd like to try to impact it if we can, and create something, get some spending this year if possible.
Well, I'll give you my own view, Councilor Kalus, which is that if I had heard the superintendent or the school committee come to us and say, please don't spend the money this way, we really need $4 million immediately to do X, I might have felt differently, but I haven't heard that from anybody. I also don't have confidence that first of all, as everybody knows, I want to make it crystal clear. We, the council, don't have the authority, even if all the finance committee members agree to do this another way, to actually do that.
Right.
The authority would be for us to give that feedback to the mayor and for her to consider whether or not she would want to propose and then come back to us with her, agreement that this proposal makes sense. So I want everybody who's watching to understand that any brainstorming that takes place is brainstorming that then would be proposed to the mayor for her consideration, not something binding that we could do. I personally am also skeptical that Josh Morse and his team would immediately be able to then turn around tomorrow and start, you know, whatever projects with this arbitrary number that we just landed on to do something that is, you know, going to go to work immediately tomorrow, you know, right away. And what I like about this plan is that it sets out a stream of revenue that the school committee can plan on and budget for what they see as the highest and best purpose. And it actually makes sense to me that the money isn't appropriated in this year. Last spring, I wanted to see it that way, but that budget's already been set. Those human beings are already, like, bodies are in the buildings. You know, we're not going to go hire 15 kindergarten aides with money that we approved today for the rest of this year. I just don't think that's practical. So I am interested in others' views, though. Councillor Norton?
Thank you. So I am sympathetic that this stuff is really complicated. Many of us who, especially who do not have a finance background, it can be very, very complicated. And maybe some of us might think we have a better way of doing things, but I feel like I saw that movie before a few months ago when there were a group of counselors, I think all but me actually, who thought it would make sense to do our own negotiations with the retirement board. And we ended up exactly where we started, because this really is squarely, to my mind, within the responsibility and area of the executive branch. They've got Maureen and the other big brains, if anyone has as big a brain as Maureen, on finance. And so we really rely on her. Doesn't mean we always agree with her. As she can attest, I have not always agreed with everything with her over the last 10 years, but that really is her area. So the idea that we would, as a body, come up with our own scheme, I don't think that's a good idea. People can vote down what is being proposed. I do not think that it's bad what's being proposed. To me, it makes sense. If anyone should be mad about it, it should be people on the city side who are seeing the funding go to the pensions, which, by the way, I don't see a different number. It's 6.6. This is a way of getting to the 6.6 that's a little slightly painless, more painless. But we already have an agreement to increase it 6.6. So this is pulling a little bit, so it only feels like 5. So that's not really any different. And then the rest of it's going to the schools. So if you want money going to the schools, which a lot of us do, that's what I see happening. So if anything, that's why I was like, I want my $500,000 to do an analysis of our flooding. That's really what's one thing you hear me lobbying for. So I'm going to, go back to the stormwater folks for that. So anyway, to me, this seems reasonable. I think we should go ahead with it. Obviously, it didn't sound like everyone else is there, but I just wanted to offer that up. I would vote this thing out tonight if I had the opportunity.
You just summarized my feelings better than I was able to summarize my own feelings, Councilor Norton. So thanks. Others? Okay, so Councilor Humphrey.
I was just going to move hold based on my earlier comments.
Okay, and I was just going to ask folks where they're at. So I hear at least, I'm thinking at least 3 people who are interested in discussing this again on Thursday night. Why don't we discuss Councilor Humphrey's motion? Is anybody opposed to hold? Anybody want to discuss it further? Councilor Kalis?
Yeah, I mean, I threw out an idea because I thought I heard that, and obviously I was wrong, and that's okay. If that's the case, I also am ready to move it, like Councilor Norton, because I feel like you're right. It is the job of the mayor and Ms. Lemieux, but if we're not gonna, it seems like there's not an appetite within the councilors to actually come up with ideas, because we all feel like, they are charged with doing it and they have a thoughtful plan. I mean, I wouldn't have come up with it, that's for sure. And I think it's, it does, as Councilor Norton said, it does get to where we want, which is supporting the schools primarily as the years go out. It just doesn't have the component of spending the money this year, and that's where I was a little. I found that to be a little unfortunate, but yeah, I would move it as well.
Councilor Kalus, I would just give one footnote, which is to say, I guess it's not that I don't have the appetite to brainstorm other ideas. It's that my top priority is for it to go to the school operations. And I see that this is doing that, like Councilor Norton said. So I'm good with it.
Yeah.
I really appreciate where your head was at and your thinking on it. And I appreciate your comments back about our process. Councilor Humphrey.
Well, I mean, I'm certainly open to having that discussion about alternative ideas. I don't know if it actually necessarily has to happen in Finance Committee in the same way that those discussions don't happen in Finance Committee before the budget is prepared and before the overrides are prepared, because you're talking about the money, not about the specific proposal in that case. But I'm certainly not going to have that discussion at 9:30 at night, starting now. So, you know, if we were to have a discussion on that, I'd want to have it at another meeting where we've had some time to prepare and so forth. And also, as Councilor Grossman said earlier, we haven't heard from the school committee and superintendent in an official capacity on some of this stuff. I've heard privately some things, and that they felt like they weren't really able to weigh in because this was a matter at the moment between the between the mayor and the city council. The other thing I'd say is this is different from some of the other things that we have to vote on in this committee and in the full council. Because this is a specific proposal that we are being asked to vote up or down on, in fact, by a 2/3 majority, apparently, not by a simple majority. So, and then we're going to have to vote on it, it sounds like, in future to use the money as well. So kind of does involve us. We are actually being asked something. Apparently, we're being asked to, in the future, be thanked for our work on putting this together collaboratively, even though it wasn't put together collaboratively. So it seems to me that we definitely are in a position to be having a more serious discussion about this and not just voting it out. But also, I don't know why we'd be voting it out tonight when we don't have the finalized legal language for this that it sounded like most of the committee wanted. Thank you.
Well, on that point, that is the one point I was debating in my mind as well, and that people need to think about. It's certainly typical in our process for those kinds of things to get worked out and then presented subject to second call before the full council. I'm okay with that. If other people are not okay with that, then you should vote to hold and we should meet again on Thursday night. I honestly am trying to be, to me, it's also about balancing what we're asking of the committee and not asking folks to give another night unless we think that there's going to be an effective, substantive further discussion. If there is, I am more than happy to have it. I'm always happy to spend as much time as folks want. I just want to be respectful of everyone's time if you feel you're already at your mind made up on this point. And if enough folks are not, then we'll meet again. Councilor Norton and Malachy.
I will vote against hold.
Councilor Malachy.
I would like to hold it, if only to give councilors Gentile and Markowitz a chance to participate, because they and many of our fellow councilors are wrapped up in zoning and planning tonight.
I see that Councilor Gentile has joined us. Councilor Gentile, are you there? Okay, he's not. In that case, any further discussion before we have a vote on hold? Okay, seeing none, let's vote on the motion to hold. I'm going to ask everybody to use their virtual hands so that we can count clearly. All those in favor of hold, please raise your virtual hand. Okay, hands down. Those opposed to hold, please raise your virtual hand. And hands down. Abstentions. Councillor Noel, did you vote? Sorry, I can't hear
Wait,
you.
I tried to vote and I opened up Apple Music. I would like to abstain.
You would like to abstain. So,
On a
Mr.
motion to hold.
I think we had 2 in favor of hold, 3 opposed to hold, and 1 abstention. Is that correct?
Yes.
That is correct.
What about Councilor Oliver?
I was a hold.
Wait, you were in. Wait, hold on a second.
Yep.
You were in favor of hold?
In favor of hold.
Did I miss your hand? Because I saw Councillor Humphrey and Maliki in favor of hold.
You may have missed my hand.
All right, let's do it again. All those in favor of hold, please raise your virtual hand. Okay, hands down. All those, hands down. Okay, all those opposed to hold, raise your virtual hand. Okay, hands down. Abstentions. Hand down. Councillor Humphrey, you probably know the answer to this. I don't. What happens on a tie?
Yeah, so if it's a tie, that means the motion fails, which means we can't hold it. So we have to do something else with it unless we revote it again. But
okay. In that case, do we have a motion on this item?
I'll move it.
Okay, motion to approve by Councillor Norton. Is there, by the way, Councillor Norton, would you be open to moving it subject to second call?
Yes,
With the
updated language. Yes.
The language. Okay, great. So any further discussion on that? Okay. Councillor Noel, was that discussion? Sorry, I see your real hand.
So I just want to clarify so I don't get the evil eye from Councillor Humphrey. My feeling is there's more work to be done here. But I also am getting a sense that half this committee is ready to move forward. And I think that it will then happen in the larger committee. So I'm going to abstain on this vote as well, because I think there's more work to be done. But I think I have to go with the will of the committee. And I think that we're going to move this to a larger, I don't think we have the votes to continue the work here. Okay. Thank you.
Councillor Maliki.
I was just thinking it appears that Councillor Gentile is still trying to connect to audio. Oh, there he is. I was just going to say it would be nice to have a tiebreaker.
Okay, Councillor Gentile, can you hear us now?
On mute.
Councillor Gentile, can you unmute a second? I just wanted to catch you up.
Yes, can you hear me?
Okay, you can hear us. Okay, great. So I don't know if you were following along, but I just want to give you the recap of where we are because you're joining us at a somewhat pivotal moment. So having discussed this for a while, there was a discussion about whether we hold the item for further work and go ahead with the Thursday night meeting. And we had a tied vote, 3 in favor of hold, 3 opposed to hold, and 1 abstention. So that motion to hold failed. We now have a motion to approve subject to second call before us by Councillor Norton. The intent of the subject to second call being working out the legal language in the council order to make sure that it accurately reflects the intent of the stabilization fund as the administration has set it forth to the council's satisfaction. And we're currently discussing that motion to approve subject to second call right now. So I definitely understand the conflict you had tonight and needing to participate in zoning and planning, but wanted to give you the opportunity if you wanted to speak to this, since we seem to be in a pretty tied situation at the moment.
Well, I can, I don't know what I should do, to be honest with you. I'm a little frustrating from my evening with zoning and planning, but that's not your fault or problem. I have some definite views, which I could probably summarize in 2 minutes for you, but you may have already, made decisions on the issues that I wanted to raise with regard to the booster fund. And I don't know what to say about, the Thursday meeting not having participated. But I guess can I just take 2 minutes to get my thoughts on record? And you guys have probably already covered all of this, but at least I'd like it here.
I don't mean to interrupt you, but Councilor Grossman, maybe we should summarize for him what we've talked about.
No, I can save you time if you just let me give you my thoughts on the fund, and then whatever you decide for Thursday night, I think the people that were here should make that decision.
I'm good with that, and I would like your thoughts.
So first of all, as you know, I tried at budget time to set up a reserve fund, so I'm very much in favor of the idea of setting up the reserve fund. The reservations that I have are if I were modeling it, I would not have set it up so that all the money, the $26 million, was spent at the end of what I believe is an 8-year period. I would have preferred that the fund be set up in a way to spend the interest that it generated and then cap a certain amount of the principal, with the idea that at the end of 8 years, we would hopefully have, maybe 50% of it left. I just don't understand why we have to commit now to spending all the money over a certain period of time. That was my first thought. Secondly, in the past, one-time monies, whether they were free cash or overlay surplus, typically most of that money gets spent on capital improvement items. And if I understand correctly, we're not talking about spending a dime on capital improvement projects. And in the past, this is where a lot of the money comes from. And I'm sure that because we're doing so well with free cash, that you probably heard that that's where we'll continue to be a source of money for capital improvement projects. But we've got page after page after page of capital projects, very worthwhile projects. And I think that some of this money should be earmarked to get some capital improvement projects done. I think there's, many that you can think of in your individual wards that, would be great things to get done. And I don't like the fact that we're precluding that from happening. So, and then I guess the third point, I really don't understand what's going on with the schools. And it troubles me that so much of this money, and I was around in the beginning when Maureen went over all of the efforts that have already been made to lighten up on the school budget. She went over, there was, I don't know, $27 million worth of things that we have already done. And now we're talking about 70% of this money, that's going to be going into the operating budget is going to go to the schools. And we're in a period of significant, not minor, but significant declining enrollment, which has always saved us in the past from having such budget pressure in the schools when you have declining enrollment. And I don't understand, why all of this money is going into operations, and so much of it is going to the school department at a time of, as I say, declining enrollment. That was always the one. Nobody likes declining enrollment. When I was in school, there were over 18,000 kids. And, I think it's great when you have a lot of kids in the school system. But when it's declining, the one benefit of it was that it helps you to save money and there's less pressure on the budget. And yet it seems as though we're going in the opposite direction. So those are just, you know, my general thoughts. It's a great idea to set up the fund, but I just think to, you know, automatically lock it in and say we're going to spend all the money in 8 years. I don't see why we have to do that. And I think that that some of the money should be allocated towards something other than, you know, the operating budget, that there are plenty worthwhile needs. So that's pretty much, those are my thoughts.
You just made me think of something, and I don't mean to throw a wrench in things, but I want to direct an idea to Councillor Humphrey. Would it make you feel any better if in the council order language, the possibility of school capital improvement projects was preserved as a potential purpose of the funds?
I don't think that necessarily addresses what I was getting at in terms of immediate upfront capital needs, although I understand the point that he was making. But also, as I said earlier, from what we've been told and what we've heard and what's been presented, this isn't a schools plan, it's a pensions plan that the savings will be applied in theory towards schools. So to my understanding, there isn't going to be anything about schools in the language, really.
Ms. Lemieux, I think it's fair to say that the language is going to need to say something about schools for the council to feel, well, I can't speak for the council. The language will need to say something about schools unless there's some really compelling reason it can't, at least for me to feel good about it. I'll speak for myself.
That certainly is the way that I intend to approach it with the law department. So unless there's some reason why we can't really codify what it is that the plan is, then I would expect that there be a mention of the schools.
Okay, so let's talk about where we are procedurally. Councillor Norton has made a motion to approve subject to second call. Are there other comments or debate that members of the committee would like to have before we have a vote on that?
Madam Chair, did anyone ask the question? I mean, this administration basically has a little over 2 years left. It may, you know, they might be here for another 20. I don't know, but I've just assumed that. I mean, no one thinks that this vote can bond or can bind future mayors from doing what they see fit, or is that? Are we being told that if we vote this thing and it's an 8-year plan, that a new mayor couldn't come in and, you know, say, I don't think that's a wise way to spend money these next 6 years? Or is this somehow binding on future administrations?
So we did talk about that a little bit. Mr. Curley, do you want to summarize what you shared on that point?
Sure, thank you. So this is some language from Chapter 40, Section B, which is the establishment of stabilization funds. And it states, at the time of creating any stabilization fund, the city, town, or district shall specify and at any later time may alter the purpose of the fund, which may be for any lawful purpose. And that, I think, led to the discussion where Ms. Lemieux and myself are going to work with the law department on language. I think it's largely going to be led by Ms. Lemieux, but there is a way to narrow the scope of the use of the stabilization fund.
And essentially that requires a 2/3 vote to establish the fund. The fund then has to survive in the form we've established it for a minimum of 3 years. And it requires a 2/3 vote to appropriate the money out of the fund at any given time.
Yes.
And then the last question was, what is required to close the fund?
So when I first heard Steve read, you know, the chapter, it sounded like, the money could be spent in any manner, but now I'm not so sure that I heard that correctly.
Well, the manner specified, you can establish it for any lawful purpose, but then once you establish it, you're establishing, if you kind of think how we do it for a revolving fund, you're putting in writing in the council order the established purpose. And that was what got us into that was part of what got us into the debate about whether we hold it or not, whether we meet again on Thursday night to go over the council order in greater detail, or whether we make it subject to second call and debate the council order language before the full council on second call. And that was the vote that ultimately failed in a tie, with three in favor of hold, 3 opposed to hold, and 1 abstention.
So are we being told that it basically binds us in the administration for 3 years, and then it's
within the confines of whatever language we would pass if the council passes it in the council order?
So Maureen, did you, Maureen, I'm sorry to come in at the last minute on you, but did you address why you have this need to try and lock up this money in this way for the next 8 years? You don't want the flexibility to be able to spend it on maybe something else that's more important at a given time 4 years from now?
So, in my opinion, and there are many, many opinions on this, but in my opinion, what we were really trying to do was to free up some of the pressure points in the budget so that we can get pensions funded and redirect more money to the schools. That's exactly what we were trying to do. By taking the full amount, what happens is that by the time we get to years 2029 or 2030, 31, and 32, the schools will benefit, as well as the city or the Gap will also benefit from greater funds than if we spent, say, I don't know, 5 million now on different projects and only put 20 or 21 million into the fund. The goal was to try to really minimize how much we have to increase the pension funding amount each year, so that we can repurpose those funds and put the majority of those funds to the schools. And all of these years, it still only gets the increase in the school appropriation up to, I think, because we were adding this in as whole dollars, but I think in 1 or 2 of the years, it might be as much as 3.72 and 3.73, and as low as 3.67 or 3.68 in a few of the years. So we've said all along that it's approximately 3.7%. So our goal was to make sure we stayed with the funding schedule, but this is not a pension plan. This is about trying to make sure that we can move funds to the school department.
Right. And didn't I see somewhere where the quote funds, and I'm not exactly sure what which funds we're talking about, but I thought I saw a schedule where 70% of the funds are going to be dedicated to the school department.
Yes. That's our intent. And so I think where we were, Councillor Gentile, is that my intent was to leave here to work with the law department tomorrow and the next day to figure out how tight can we or should we write the board order, taking all this information that I've heard from you this evening. And so I think depending on what's in the board order, there may be some people who think that you don't want it quite as tight, if you might want to do different things with it. If we make it exactly as we are proposing, then that's what it is, and that's what the purpose would be, I think, unless time went by and 2/3 of the council and the mayor decided to do something different with it. The way it was written, attached to your agenda, seemed pretty loose to me. And so I think that's almost on one end of the spectrum. we can either tighten it up all the way or land somewhere in the middle. But it was certainly my intent that tomorrow I would start working with the law department and figure out what the board order ought to say.
All right, last question, because I'm holding people up that have been there. The urgency. I mean, this is September the 11th. What is the urgency that you'd have to meet again on Thursday? This couldn't go the normal route, the normal committee schedule, or maybe I didn't read it, maybe I didn't see it, but what is the urgency that everybody would have to deal with this on this coming Thursday?
So if I can answer, our hope was that you would be able to take a vote at the next full city council meeting, which is the 18th, so that by the end of the month, we could have put all of this in motion. This year is probably the highest interest that we will see being earned, and especially if we're starting with our 26 million now. So I'm forecasting that the fund would earn over $100,000 a month this year. And so it's really a matter of setting it up as early as we can so that we can start to generate as much interest as we can.
All right. Of course, it's a little frustrating because when I made that argument a few months ago, it didn't seem to carry water. So haste makes waste. I don't see where we have to rush. The money's, as you know, the money's probably in the MMDT, and it's probably getting over 5% right now anyway. So you're not talking a big spread. It's making good money. So it might go in, I don't know, it might go to T-bills, whatever, and make a little bit more, but it's making a good chunk of change right now. So
if I may, just to be totally transparent, because we did talk about this earlier when you were not here, Councilor Gentile, there may be no difference in the amount of money that it earns. Even if we left it in MMDT, the difference is that once it's a stabilization fund, the interest goes to the stabilization fund. If these funds just keep sitting where they are, then the interest goes to the general fund.
But you can then appropriate to this fund once you set it up, right? You can do that. All right. I don't want to keep people around any longer than they need to be.
Councilor Noel.
To Councilor Gentile's point, I really like the idea of putting this back on the regular schedule. My other ambivalence about holding this till Thursday is I don't know how much time I'm going to have to think and investigate into this on Thursday and talk to my constituents. So I would love the idea of revisiting this conversation at the next regularly scheduled finance meeting. And I know we can't walk backwards on a vote, but I don't see much. This seems a lot to digest, a lot I want to think about. I need to talk to constituents. I want to vet it with other people and see what they think about it. And I don't see that happening before Thursday.
Okay, let's recap where we are procedurally, which is that we have a motion before us to approve subject to second call. So the way I see it, although those of you who are sharper on procedure than me, let me know if you disagree. We either complete our debate on that and vote it. And in that case, we would have moved it to the full council, which meets next Monday, right? Or folks could ask Councilor Norton to withdraw her motion, and we could have some type of a motion to reconsider the earlier motion to hold. Does anybody have any further comments on what I just said? Otherwise, we're back to Councilor Norton's motion and a vote on that.
I'm happy to withdraw it if people want to take it to another meeting.
Councilor Kalis? I can't hear you.
I would say let's vote on Councilor Norton's motion.
Anybody else? Okay, Councillor Norton, it's up to you, but I think we still have your
I'll
motion.
keep it. I I made
repeat
the
the
motion.
question?
I believed in moving ahead with this.
Can you repeat the question? I was distracted for a minute.
I just asked Councillor Norton essentially if she had any interest in withdrawing her motion, and at which point, if folks wanted, we could reconsider the motion to hold. She said she was open to whatever folks wanted to do, and Councillor Kalis said he thinks we should proceed on Councillor Norton's motion and vote this out to the full council.
If you're asking opinions, I would love to slow this down and per Councillor Gentile's selection, put this recommendation or comment, put this on the regular schedule, hold it, let this cook till the next finance meeting.
Okay, others?
Okay.
Councillor Norton, I think we're back to you. So do you want to proceed with your motion or do you want to withdraw your motion?
Can anyone else make a comment here? I got Dave's with me. Brenda's not. Lenny wants to delay it.
I'd love to go back and hold it.
I just
Councillor Malachy, then Kalis.
As I said before, I'd like to hold it too.
I've already made clear that I'm happy to proceed. Councillor Kalis, then Humphrey.
Yeah, I'm happy to proceed. I just don't know what's going to change in the next 2 days. If anybody can tell me that, then great. But Councillor Oliver, Councillor Malachy, what you just said, I don't get it. Like, what do you want to talk about on Thursday that we haven't talked about today?
I think we need to think a little bit. It's kind of a big deal. So I think we should put it on the regular schedule and revisit this in 2 weeks.
It's not.
All right, guys, I just want to stick to hands so that we don't get out of control here. We have 2 more hands waiting. Councillor Kalis, why don't you finish up?
Are you, so the schedule though, just to be clear, is to meet on Thursday, not on the regular schedule. Is that correct?
That is the schedule that we've set up, and I set that up after essentially hearing from the mayor's office and Ms. Lemieux and talking with President Albright and the clerk's office. And we looked at availability and timing to try to respect the administration's desire to have something clear one way or the other by the end of the month. To Councillor Gentile's point, I mean, the council will do what we do, and they will react and respond and take steps accordingly. So if the finance committee isn't willing to do that, then we won't do that. But that is what is currently established on the schedule. And then as Ms. Lemieux explained it.
I appreciate that. I'm just going to say one more thing. I'd prefer it go and be discussed and on second call be reverted back if it needs to be. Miss Councillor Noel, that's why I'm pushing this, because I just feel like we can just rehashing it in committee again is not going to do anything. Thank you.
Councillor Humphrey, then Oliver.
Yeah, following up on that, I think we can just vote yes or no on this. And if a majority vote yes, then that'll be a favorable recommendation to the full council. And if 4 or more vote no on it, then that will be a negative recommendation to the full council. But either way, it'll still go to the full council for a discussion on second call.
Councillor Oliver.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I was recommending or still recommending hold based on the fact that we could put it back onto the regular schedule. If that's not on the table, I'm happy to vote this out. And if we pass it, because I think the motion is to vote approval pending second call, I believe. If that's the case, I'm happy to vote it out tonight. But I do think that we've heard enough conversation here to warrant further investigation and some thoughtful, like, this is kind of a big deal. And it's okay to me if we hold this for the full council, to have a further debate on second call that will allow us a few more days anyway to ask some more questions, get some more answers. Happy to do that. I'm also happy to have it on hold, if we can, because 2 days isn't going to do much. But if we can get this back onto kind of our regularly scheduled programming, that would be great. So I guess long-winded way of saying, let's vote it out accordingly, according to Councilor Norton's proposal.
Councilor Malachy, then Humphrey.
Yeah, I got a text from Councilor Markowitz. I know he doesn't get to vote, but he would like to get into this meeting, and he's been trying to get in and nobody seems to notice him.
Mr. Cudmore, can you look for Councilor Markowitz? Do you see him?
Yeah, I'm not seeing him at the top. I can try and reload or troubleshoot.
Okay, well, we'll keep an eye out for him. Thank you. Councilor Humphrey?
Sorry, just to repeat myself slightly, Madam Chair, do you agree with my interpretation, though? And I guess we can also ask Councilor Gentile, who's been here a long time, that people can vote yes or no. Either way, it gets moved out, but it's okay to vote no if someone wants it to, if they're against it, but they want to have it discussed at the full council, right?
I think so. Absolutely. I mean, we have items that go to the full council with a positive recommendation, and we have items that go to the full council with a negative recommendation, and all kinds of possibilities can then happen on second call from that. So I agree with that.
All right, thank you.
And for Gentile, you agree with that too, right?
Yes. The only thing I'm wondering about is, I think a big part of this, whether you support it, the concept or not, is the language that that is going to establish the fund. And I guess what I'm thinking about is, when that gets tightened up, when Maureen works with the law department and it comes back to us and we've voted it out, how, there'll be some questions. I would think there'll be some questions about the language, and as long as people, I don't know how you're going to get those questions answered necessarily by the law department if we're planning on discussing this in second call. That's why I think that it should have another discussion, and maybe it wouldn't even be that long in finance, because it sounds from what you were describing earlier that there was definitely some questions about the language and setting up the fund.
Ms. Lemieux, let me ask you to weigh in on this a second, because you're assuming a little bit of a risk here if we do not meet again on Thursday night with whatever language you put before us, subject to second call on Monday night. Do you have an opinion one way or another on this?
I was actually thinking, I was just trying to pull up my calendar. And then I just realized we have CIP on Monday. I was thinking if it made sense, we could work on the language, have the language in your packets for Friday. And if we could find, 45 minutes on Monday before everything begins to kind of go over it, maybe go over it in finance again. I think it probably does make sense for you to look at the language, and you could still end up voting it out if you're ready on Monday after that. I don't know the Thursday that gives us collectively enough time for people to think about what they want to do, for the law department to think about the language. This way, if we put it in the packets for Friday, you'd have time to read it and think about it over the weekend. But I don't know if Monday works.
It doesn't for me. I mean, others could meet and debate it, but that's, and I guess I also just don't really see, if we debate it Monday night and we have this meeting of finance and people aren't satisfied, where does that leave us? At least if we have it on Thursday, if people aren't satisfied, we have a few days to figure out what to do with it.
I don't think the language, I don't think there will be huge revelations or changes with the language. It will be how much, can or should we put in the board order to reflect exactly what the plan is. If that's what it is that we're all meeting to discuss, I mean, that's what I plan on working with the law department on.
Okay, would you be willing, and I suppose you'd have to check with City Solicitor Giuliani, to ask City Solicitor Giuliani to be available to come inside the rail on Monday night on second call if need be to answer questions.
So I can tell you, I certainly would be willing to, and I would certainly ask City Solicitor Giuliani that same question.
Again, I'll reflect the will of what everybody wants to do. I'm perfectly happy to meet on Thursday night and discuss this further and go over the language if folks think that's advantageous. I don't think doing it in a consolidated way Monday before the council, it doesn't work for me. It could work for everybody else, but it doesn't feel like the right approach to me. So
let's just vote it out.
I'm not really sure where that leaves us.
It's too late. We got to just vote it out.
Voting it out
probably
is the way to go. But if folks feel strongly, let's meet Thursday. Anybody want to say anything else? All right, Councillor Norton, it's back to you. Are we proceeding with your motion or do you want to withdraw it?
Onward.
Okay, we're going to proceed with Councillor Norton's motion. Any other discussion before we vote on the motion to approve subject to second call? I don't see any further discussion. Let's do this with virtual hands. All those in favor, please raise your virtual hand. Okay, hands down. All those opposed, please raise your virtual hand. Okay, hands down. Oops, sorry about that. And abstentions. Don't we have at least one person who didn't vote?
Yeah, I'm trying. My click is not working well.
Okay, so you're abstaining, Councillor Gentile, right?
Yes.
Okay, so then by my vote, we had 3 in favor, 4 opposed, 1 abstention. In which case the motion fails, which is essentially a recommendation to deny. Is that everybody's understanding?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Then that is where we're at. That does it for tonight. And then we do not meet on Thursday night. So that meeting will be canceled. And this will be on second call before the full council on Monday night. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks. Good night.
Good night.